On a gray February morning in 2006, in a small Ohio town where everyone knew everyone's name, a mother walked into the county sheriff's office and reported that her 5-year-old daughter had not come home from school. The girl had last been seen boarding the yellow school bus that stopped at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street at 3:15 in the afternoon. By 9 o'clock that evening, when deputies fanned out across the neighborhoods with flashlights cutting through the winter darkness, the whole town understood that something terrible had happened. The child's pink backpack would be found 2 days later in a drainage ditch 7 miles outside of town, empty, except for a single worksheet about the water cycle and a half-eaten granola bar. But the little girl herself seemed to have vanished into the cold Ohio air. The question that would haunt this community for nearly 2 decades was not just where she had gone, but who had taken her, and whether anyone had suspected the truth all along. Millbrook, Ohio, population 4,236, sat in the northeastern corner of Ashland County like a pocket of America that time had gently forgotten. The town had one traffic light, blinking yellow after 9 in the evening. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, anchored on one end by the First Baptist Church with its white steeple, and on the other by Henderson's Hardware, which had been run by the same family since 1952. Between them stood the usual markers of small-town life. A diner called Ruthie's that served breakfast all day, a post office in a brick building with ivy climbing its walls, a library that opened only 3 days a week, and a pharmacy where old men gathered on benches outside to talk about the weather and the Cleveland Indians. The houses in Millbrook spread out from Main Street in a grid pattern that made sense only if you had lived there your whole life. Most were built in the 1920s and 30s, wood-frame structures with front porches and small yards enclosed by chain-link fences. In winter, the trees stood bare against the sky, their branches black and intricate like cracks in glass. The town existed in that particular American landscape where manufacturing jobs had dried up 2 decades earlier, leaving behind a population that worked in neighboring cities or scraped together a living from service jobs and small businesses. Everyone knew everyone. Children rode their bikes without supervision. Doors remained unlocked. It was the kind of place where people said they chose to raise their families because it was safe. Jessica Marie Caldwell was 5 years old in February 2006. She lived with her mother, Linda Caldwell, age 32, and her mother's boyfriend, Marcus Webb, age 34, in a rental house on Sycamore Street, 3 blocks south of the elementary school. The house was painted yellow with white trim, though the paint had begun to peel near the foundation. A metal swing set stood in the backyard, its chains squeaking whenever the wind picked up. Jessica was in kindergarten at Millbrook Elementary, where her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, later described her as quiet but friendly, a child who loved to draw pictures of horses and princesses with careful attention to detail. Linda Caldwell worked the morning shift at the supermart on Route 42, stocking shelves and running the register when needed. She had moved to Millbrook from Columbus 3 years earlier, hopping for a fresh start after a difficult period that those who knew her declined to specify in detail. She had met Marcus Webb at the supermart, where he worked in the warehouse unloading trucks. He moved into the house on Sycamore Street 8 months before Jessica disappeared. Neighbors later told investigators that Marcus seemed like a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, always nodded hello, but never stopped to chat. He drove an older model blue pickup truck with rust along the wheel wells. He worked irregular hours and sometimes could be seen in the driveway in the middle of the afternoon, working on the truck or sitting on the front steps with a cigarette. The morning of February 14, 2006, began like any other Tuesday in Millbrook. The temperature hovered around 32 degrees. A thin layer of frost covered the car windshields. Linda Caldwell woke at 5:30, as she always did, and made coffee in the kitchen while the house remained dark and quiet. She woke Jessica at 6:15, helped her get dressed in jeans and a purple sweater with a cartoon character on the front, and made her scrambled eggs and toast. Marcus was already gone, having left for an early shift at the warehouse. This detail would later be verified, then questioned, then verified again through security footage and time cards that never quite aligned as neatly as they should have. Linda dropped Jessica at school at 7:45, watching her daughter walk through the front doors with her pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders. It was the last time Linda Caldwell would see her daughter alive. The school day proceeded normally. Jessica attended her classes, ate lunch in the cafeteria at 11:30, and spent afternoon recess on the playground where she played on the swings with two other girls from her class. At 3:15, she boarded bus number 17, driven by Harold Perkins, a retired postal worker who had been driving school buses for 6 years. Harold would later tell investigators that Jessica sat in her usual seat, 4 rows back on the right side. She had her backpack with her. She looked out the window like she always did. Nothing seemed unusual or wrong. The bus route followed a precise pattern every afternoon. It left the school at 3:17, stopped at the corner of Oak and First at 3:22, at Pine and 4th at 3:28, and reached the corner of Maple and 3rd, where Jessica was supposed to get off at 3:34. Harold Perkins remembered opening the door. He remembered Jessica standing up, and then his memory became less certain. Did she step off the bus? He thought so. He believed so. But in the chaos of children moving and talking and gathering their belongings, he could not swear to it with absolute certainty. What he did remember clearly was that, when he closed the door and pulled away from the stop, he did not see Jessica on the sidewalk in his mirror. But that did not concern him because parents or guardians usually met the younger children right at the stop. Except no one was waiting for Jessica that afternoon. Linda Caldwell had worked until 2 o'clock and arrived home at 2:20. She had planned to walk to the bus stop at 3:30 to meet Jessica, as she often did when her schedule allowed. But at 3:15 the phone rang. It was her supervisor from Supermart, asking if she could come back in because another employee had called in sick. Linda hesitated. She asked if Marcus was home. She called out but received no answer. She looked out the window and did not see his truck in the driveway. Later, she would torture herself with the memory of this moment, the decision she made, the phone call she placed to her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, asking if she could meet Jessica at the bus stop because Linda had to go back to work. Mrs. Chen, age 67, who lived 2 doors down and sometimes watched Jessica for a few hours when Linda needed help, agreed immediately. She put on her coat and walked to the corner of Maple and 3rd, arriving at approximately 3:33, 1 minute before the bus was scheduled to arrive. She stood on the corner in her heavy winter coat, hands in her pockets, breath visible in the cold air. She watched the bus approach. She watched it slow down. She watched the door open and children pour out at various stops along the route. But when the bus reached her corner, no children got off. The door opened briefly, then closed. The bus pulled away. Mrs. Chen stood on the corner, confused, thinking perhaps Jessica had missed the bus or stayed after school for some reason. Clear's throat. Mrs. Chen walked back to the Caldwell house and tried the door. It was locked. She returned to her own house and called the school. The secretary checked with Mrs. Patterson, who confirmed that Jessica had been in class all day and had boarded the bus. Mrs. Chen called Linda at work. Linda, feeling the first cold touch of panic, left immediately and arrived home at 4:15. She called the bus depot and spoke to Harold Perkins, who was just finishing his route. He said Jessica had gotten off at her stop. Or at least he thought she had. He was almost certain. Mrs. Chen insisted no child had gotten off the bus at that corner. By 4:30, Linda Caldwell was calling neighbors. By 5 o'clock, she was driving up and down the streets, looking for the purple sweater, the pink backpack, the small figure of her daughter. By 5:45, she called the sheriff's office. By 6:30, when full darkness had settled over Millbrook and Marcus Webb had still not returned home or answered his cell phone, 3 patrol cars were parked on Sycamore Street, and deputies were organizing a systematic search. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees that night. The wind picked up from the north, carrying with it the smell of snow that would not fall for another 2 days. Inside the yellow house with peeling paint, Linda Caldwell sat at the kitchen table while a female deputy asked her questions about what Jessica had been wearing, whether she had any medical conditions, whether there had been any problems at school, whether there were any custody issues with Jessica's father. Linda answered mechanically, her voice flat with shock. Jessica's father had not been in the picture since she was an infant. No custody issues, no medical conditions, no problems at school, purple sweater, pink backpack, blue jeans, white sneakers with pink laces. Where was Marcus? The deputy asked gently. Linda did not know. He was supposed to be at work, but she had not been able to reach him. His shift should have ended at 3 o'clock. At 7:41 that evening, Marcus Webb's blue pickup truck pulled into the driveway. He walked into a house full of law enforcement and civilians, his face registering surprise, then concern, then what witnesses later described as an odd blankness. Where had he been? He had been at work, then stopped at a friend's house. His phone had died. What friend? A guy named Derek who lived over in Ashland. They had been working on Derek's motorcycle. Deputies took down the information. Marcus asked what was happening. When they told him Jessica was missing, he sat down heavily in a kitchen chair and put his head in his hands. By midnight, over 50 volunteers had joined the search. They walked through backyards and vacant lots with flashlights. They checked drainage ditches and abandoned buildings. They called Jessica's name into the darkness until their voices grew hoarse. The temperature continued to drop. The search would continue through the night and into the next day and the day after that, expanding outward in concentric circles from the corner of Maple and 3rd, where a little girl had either gotten off a school bus or had not, where someone had either been waiting or had not, where something had happened in the space of seconds that would change everything. Part 2. The investigation. The search operation on February 15th began at dawn with twice as many volunteers as the night before. The Ashland County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the Ohio State Highway Patrol and the FBI field office in Cleveland. Search teams divided Millbrook and the surrounding areas into grid sections. Trained search and rescue volunteers arrived with tracking canines. The dogs were given Jessica's clothing to scent and led along possible routes from the bus stop. One dog showed interest in a trail leading south toward the industrial park, but the scent disappeared near the railroad tracks. Another dog circled the drainage area behind the old textile mill, but found nothing conclusive. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Ruthie's Diner became an unofficial command center, providing free coffee and sandwiches to searchers. The First Baptist Church opened its basement for volunteers to rest between shifts. Local businesses printed flyers with Jessica's school photograph, showing a small girl with light brown hair and a shy smile. The flyers were distributed across 3 counties, posted on telephone poles and in store windows. A tip line was established. The calls came in steadily, mostly well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful. Someone thought they saw a girl matching Jessica's description at a rest stop near Toledo. Someone else reported a suspicious vehicle in a neighboring town 2 weeks earlier. Every lead was followed. None produced results. By the second day, investigators began focusing more intensely on the timeline and the people closest to Jessica. They re-interviewed Harold Perkins, the bus driver, walking him through those critical minutes at the Maple and 3rd stop. Under repeated questioning, his certainty wavered. He thought Jessica had gotten off. The door had opened. Movement had occurred. But with children talking and moving and the routine nature of the stops, he could not be absolutely certain that Jessica specifically had stepped off the bus at that specific stop. It was possible, he finally admitted, that she had remained on the bus past her stop, perhaps fallen asleep or become distracted. Investigators checked the rest of the route. They interviewed every child who had been on bus 17 that afternoon. A 7-year-old boy thought he remembered seeing Jessica near the back of the bus after the Maple and 3rd stop, but he was not sure. An 8-year-old girl said Jessica definitely got off at her regular stop, but when pressed for details, she became less confident. The final stop on the route was the county community center, where the bus returned empty. Harold Perkins swore the bus had been empty when he parked it, but had he checked every seat? Had he walked the aisle? No, he admitted. He had simply parked and locked the bus as he always did. The bus was impounded and searched. Forensic technicians examined every surface. They found nothing unusual, nothing that indicated a struggle or violence, only the accumulated debris of a vehicle used daily to transport children. Attention turned to Marcus Webb. Those who knew him said he was difficult to read. He had grown up in Pennsylvania, moved to Ohio for work, had no criminal record beyond a minor charge for underage drinking when he was 19. He worked steadily but without ambition. He paid his bills. He did not cause trouble, but there was something about him, neighbors would later tell reporters, something they could not quite name, a distance, a flatness in his eyes, the way he looked at people without quite seeing them. Deputies interviewed him formally on February 16th. The interview lasted 4 hours and was recorded. Marcus explained his movements on February 14th in detail. He had clocked in at the warehouse at 6:15 in the morning. He had worked until 3 o'clock, confirmed by his supervisor and time card. He had then driven to his friend Derek's house in Ashland, approximately 23 miles away. They had worked on a motorcycle in Derek's garage until sometime after 7, when Marcus had left to return home and found the police at his house. Derek confirmed the story. He said Marcus had arrived around 3:30 and they had worked on the bike until after 7. But when investigators checked the mileage and travel times, discrepancies emerged. The drive from the warehouse to Derek's house should have taken 35 to 40 minutes. Marcus claimed he arrived at 3:30, but he had not clocked out until 3 o'clock. Even accounting for travel time, there was a gap of approximately 20 to 30 minutes that remained unaccounted for. Where had he been during that time? Marcus said he had stopped for gas. Where? He could not remember exactly. Maybe the Shell station on Route 42, or maybe the BP near the highway. Did he have a receipt? No, he had paid cash. Investigators checked security footage from gas stations along the possible routes. They found no evidence of Marcus Webb purchasing gas on February 14th between 3 and 3:30. There was another problem. The bus stop at Maple and 3rd was less than 2 miles from the warehouse where Marcus worked. If he had clocked out at 3 and driven directly toward Ashland, he would have passed within blocks of that bus stop at approximately the same time Jessica was meant to get off the bus. Marcus maintained his composure during questioning. His voice remained steady. His story did not change in its essential details, though the specifics remained frustratingly vague. He loved Jessica like she was his own daughter, he said. He would never hurt her. The idea was unthinkable. Deputies asked to search his truck. Marcus consented. Forensic technicians went through the vehicle methodically, collecting fibers, checking for traces of blood or other biological evidence. They examined the truck bed, the cab, the area behind the seats. They found nothing obviously incriminating, but they did find mud on the floor mats that appeared fresh, and soil samples were sent to the state lab for analysis. Investigators also searched the house on Sycamore Street with Linda Caldwell's permission. They photographed Jessica's room, her clothes hanging in the closet, her toys arranged on shelves. They examined Marcus's belongings in the bedroom he shared with Linda. They found nothing that pointed to violence or wrongdoing, but deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the atmosphere in the house, a tension that seemed to predate Jessica's disappearance, a sense that all was not as it appeared. On February 17th, the search shifted to the rural areas outside Millbrook. The soil analysis from Marcus's truck showed composition consistent with several locations in the region, none of which could be definitively matched to a specific site. Searchers focused on abandoned properties, wooded areas, and bodies of water. Divers checked the reservoir 5 miles north of town. Volunteers walked through the state forest, looking for any sign of disturbance. On February 19th, a teenage boy riding his dirt bike found Jessica's pink backpack in a drainage ditch along County Road 17, approximately 7 miles southeast of Millbrook. The location was significant for several reasons. First, it was not along the bus route. Second, it was in a rural area with no houses nearby. Third, and most critically, County Road 17 intersected with Route 42, which was the route Marcus Webb would have taken if he had driven from the warehouse toward Ashland on February 14th. The backpack was intact but empty except for the worksheet and granola bar. Forensic examination revealed no fingerprints beyond those expected to belong to Jessica. The backpack had been exposed to weather but showed no signs of having been buried or concealed with any care. It appeared to have been thrown from a moving vehicle. Investigators confronted Marcus with this discovery. How did Jessica's backpack end up on a road that he had likely driven on the day she disappeared? Marcus said he could not explain it. He had not seen the backpack. He had not stopped along that road. He maintained his story without deviation, but the gaps and inconsistencies continued to accumulate like water behind a weakening dam. The media attention intensified. Local news stations ran daily updates. National outlets picked up the story. Jessica's photograph appeared on television screens across the country. The pressure on investigators grew. The pressure on Linda Caldwell became unbearable. She defended Marcus publicly at first, insisting he had nothing to do with Jessica's disappearance. But privately, doubt had begun to work its way into her mind like a splinter. By the end of February, over 300 people had been interviewed. Over 5,000 acres had been searched. Dozens of potential leads had been investigated and eliminated. But Jessica Caldwell remained missing, and the investigation had reached a point of diminishing returns. The sheriff's department continued to list the case as active, but resources were gradually redirected. Search efforts became sporadic, then stopped. The flyers faded in the sun and rain. The news crews moved on to other stories. For those who had participated in the search, who had walked through the cold calling a little girl's name, the silence that followed felt like betrayal. But there was simply nowhere left to look and nothing concrete enough to build a prosecution. The case grew cold, but it never closed. Deputies continued to follow up on occasional tips. Linda Caldwell called the sheriff's office every week, then every month, then less frequently as the years passed, and hope transformed into a different kind of knowing. Marcus Webb remained in Millbrook, living in the yellow house on Sycamore Street with Linda, though neighbors noticed they rarely spoke to each other anymore and Marcus spent more time away from home. He had not been charged with any crime. He had not been officially named as a suspect, though everyone knew where suspicion lay. He went to work. He came home. He existed in a space between accusation and proof, neither fully condemned nor truly free. Part 3. The Silence. 6 months after Jessica disappeared, Linda Caldwell stopped going to work. She spent most days in the house, moving from room to room like a ghost in her own life. The swing set in the backyard remained untouched, its chains rusted from disuse. Jessica's room stayed exactly as it had been on February 14th, clothes in the closet, toys on the shelves, the bed made with the same purple comforter. Linda cleaned the room once a week but changed nothing. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt suspicion growing in the space where trust used to live, the erosion is not sudden but gradual, a slow wearing away of certainty. Linda had believed Marcus when he said he had nothing to do with Jessica's disappearance. She had defended him to investigators, to neighbors, to her own family members who called from Columbus and suggested she leave him. But belief requires maintenance, and doubt needs only opportunity to flourish. She began to notice things she had not noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. The way Marcus avoided talking about Jessica entirely, never mentioned her name, showed no visible grief. The way he seemed relieved when the search efforts diminished, when the news coverage stopped, when life in Millbrook returned to its approximation of normal. She noticed how he deflected questions, how his story about February 14th never gained detail or texture despite being repeated dozens of times. She noticed the gap in time that he could not explain, the missing receipt, the backpack found along a road he had driven. One night in August, unable to sleep, Linda walked through the house at 3 in the morning and found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at nothing. She asked him if he was all right. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, he said he could not live like this anymore, with everyone looking at him like he was guilty of something he did not do. Linda asked him directly, standing there in the dark kitchen of the house where her daughter had lived and vanished. "Did you hurt Jessica?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the shadows. "No," he said. "I swear to you, no." But his voice carried no conviction, and Linda heard only the words, not their meaning. By November, they were sleeping in separate rooms. By Christmas, they barely spoke. Linda's family begged her to leave, to move back to Columbus, to start over somewhere Jessica's absence would not saturate every corner of existence. But Linda could not leave Millbrook. What if Jessica came back and she was not there? What if investigators found something and she was not available immediately? She remained in the yellow house, bound to it by hope and horror in equal measure. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his routines with mechanical precision. He worked his shifts at the warehouse. He spent evenings at Derek's house or at a bar on the edge of town where no one asked questions. He spoke to no one about Jessica, about the investigation, about the suspicions that clung to him like smoke. People who encountered him in those years later described an emptiness, a man going through the motions of living while remaining fundamentally absent. In January 2007, exactly 1 year after Jessica disappeared, Linda filed for a restraining order against Marcus, claiming she feared for her safety. The request was granted. Marcus moved out of the house and into a rented room above a laundromat 3 blocks away. He did not contest the order. He packed his belongings in garbage bags and left without argument, his face showing no emotion beyond a faint exhaustion. The separation did not bring Linda peace. If anything, it intensified her isolation. She had pushed away the one person who might have known what happened, if anyone knew. She had severed the last connection to that period of her life, but in doing so had also eliminated any possibility of learning the truth directly. She thought about this constantly, the possibility that Marcus held the answer and would take it with him wherever he went, that Jessica's fate would remain forever locked inside whatever darkness existed in another person's mind. The years accumulated like sediment. 2007 became 2008, then 2009. The investigation file remained open but inactive. New detectives rotated through the sheriff's department, each reviewing the case, each reaching the same conclusion: strong suspicion, insufficient evidence. The forensic analysis had revealed nothing definitive. The timeline discrepancies were troubling but not proof of anything beyond poor memory or minor deception. The backpack location was suggestive but circumstantial. Without a body, without a witness, without a confession, there was simply no way forward. Linda eventually took a job at a different store, trying to establish a routine that did not include memories of dropping Jessica at school or planning to meet her at the bus stop. She attended a support group for families of missing children that met monthly in Ashland. She spoke little during these meetings, but found some comfort in the presence of others who understood the specific texture of this kind of grief, the absence of closure, the constant tension between hope and acceptance. Marcus Webb remained in Millbrook, a fact that mystified many who thought he would flee to somewhere people did not know his story. But he stayed, working, existing, saying little. If guilt weighed on him, he showed no outward sign. If innocence sustained him, he claimed no vindication. He simply continued, day after day, in the town where everyone knew his name and what they believed he had done. In the summer of 2011, Linda began seeing a counselor who specialized in trauma. During one session, she described a recurring dream she had been having for years. In the dream, Jessica was calling to her from somewhere Linda could not see, her voice clear but the words impossible to understand. Linda searched and searched but could never find the source of the voice. She always woke from this dream with the certainty that Jessica was trying to tell her something important, something that would explain everything, if only Linda could hear it correctly. The counselor asked Linda what she thought Jessica might be trying to say. Linda was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think she is trying to tell me who took her," Linda said. "I think she has been trying to tell me all along, but I have been too afraid to listen." Part 4. The Revelation. On March 3, 2019, 13 years after Jessica Caldwell disappeared, a woman named Jennifer Morrison walked into the Ashland County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about an old case. Jennifer was 34 years old, a former resident of Millbrook who had moved to Cleveland in 2008. She had known Marcus Webb casually in 2006, had worked at the same warehouse for several months before transferring to a different location. She had followed the news about Jessica's disappearance. She had always wondered, and now, after years of carrying the weight of something she had seen, she had decided to speak. Jennifer told detectives that on February 14, 2006, she had been leaving the warehouse at the end of her shift, which had ended at 3 o'clock. She had been walking to her car in the parking lot when she saw Marcus Webb's blue pickup truck parked near the back fence, away from the other vehicles. This struck her as odd because Marcus usually parked near the entrance. As she walked past, she glanced into the truck bed and saw what she thought was a blanket or tarp covering something. The shape underneath appeared irregular, lumpy. She had not thought much of it at the time, assumed Marcus was transporting tools or equipment. But that evening, when news of Jessica's disappearance began spreading through town, Jennifer had thought about the truck, the covered shape, the unusual parking location. She had convinced herself she was reading too much into an innocent situation. She had told herself that coming forward with such a thin observation would only add to the chaos and speculation. But the image had stayed with her, returning at unexpected moments over the years, growing more troubling with distance. What had finally prompted her to come forward was a conversation with her teenage daughter, who had asked about the girl who disappeared from Millbrook when Jennifer used to live there. In explaining the story, Jennifer had heard herself describing the covered shape in Marcus Webb's truck, and her daughter had asked a simple question: "Did you tell the police?" Jennifer had to admit she had not. Her daughter had looked at her with confusion and disappointment. Why not? Jennifer had no answer that satisfied either her daughter or herself. Detectives listened carefully. They pulled the old case file and reviewed the timeline. Jennifer's account placed Marcus Webb at the warehouse at approximately 3:05, matching his time card and previous statements. But her observation about the truck provided something new, a detail that fit disturbingly well with the existing evidence. If Marcus had placed Jessica in his truck while it was parked away from witnesses, he could have driven southeast on County Road 17, discarded the backpack along the way, and continued to Derek's house in Ashland, arriving around 3:30 as he had claimed. Detectives reopened the investigation officially on March 8, 2019. They brought in the original investigators, now retired, to consult on the case. They reviewed every piece of evidence, every interview, every timeline. They located and re-interviewed Derek, Marcus's friend who had provided his initial alibi. Derek was now 47 years old and living in West Virginia. Under questioning, his story began to shift. Derek admitted that he could not be certain about the exact time Marcus had arrived on February 14th. It might have been 3:30, or it might have been later, closer to 4 or even 4:30. Pressed further, Derek acknowledged that Marcus had asked him to tell police he had arrived around 3:30, and Derek had done so because Marcus was his friend and Derek had no reason to doubt him. Derek said Marcus had seemed normal that afternoon, maybe a little quiet but nothing that raised alarm. They had worked on the motorcycle until after 7, as Derek had stated originally. That part was true. Detectives obtained a warrant to search the property where Derek had lived in 2006. The house had changed ownership twice since then, but the garage where Marcus and Derek had worked on the motorcycle remained largely unchanged. Forensic teams examined the space carefully. They found nothing. The soil around the property was tested and compared to samples from Marcus's truck taken in 2006. No conclusive match. But investigators had one more avenue to pursue. They subpoenaed cell phone records for Marcus Webb's phone from February 2006. The original investigation had requested these records, but cell tower technology was less precise in 2006, and the data had provided only general location information. However, with advances in forensic analysis, experts could now extract more detailed information from the same records. The cell tower data showed that Marcus's phone had pinged towers consistent with movement from the warehouse location toward Ashland between 3:15 and 3:45 on February 14th. But there was a cluster of pings between 3:17 and 3:26 that placed the phone in the area of downtown Millbrook, within half a mile of the intersection of Maple and 3rd Street. Marcus Webb was brought in for questioning on April 12, 2019. He was now 47 years old, grayer, thinner, but still recognizable as the man who had sat in interview rooms 13 years earlier and maintained his innocence. The lead detective, a woman named Sarah Chen who had been a junior deputy on the original case, laid out the new evidence methodically. The witness who had seen the covered shape in his truck, the refined cell tower data, the shifting alibi from Derek, the timeline that placed him in the area where Jessica had disappeared. Marcus listened without expression. When Detective Chen finished, she asked him directly, "Did you take Jessica Caldwell on February 14th, 2006? Marcus was silent for nearly 3 minutes. The recording of this interview would later be played in court, and viewers would describe those minutes as excruciating, watching a man sit motionless while the clock ticked and the truth seemed to hover just beyond reach. Finally, Marcus spoke. He said, "I want a lawyer." The interview ended. Marcus Webb was arrested and charged with abduction and endangerment of a child. The charges stopped short of homicide because Jessica's body had never been found, and prosecutors needed to be strategic about what they could prove. Bond was set at $500,000. Marcus could not afford it. He remained in custody. The arrest shocked Millbrook despite the fact that everyone had suspected Marcus for 13 years. Suspicion and confirmation are different animals, and the community reacted with a mixture of vindication and renewed grief. Linda Caldwell, informed of the arrest by Detective Chen, collapsed in her kitchen and had to be taken to the hospital for observation. She had spent 13 years knowing and not knowing, believing and not believing, and now the uncertainty had been replaced with something worse, the certainty that the man she had lived with, had trusted with her daughter, had been responsible all along. The trial began in September 2019. The prosecution built their case on the accumulated weight of circumstantial evidence, the timeline discrepancies, the cell tower data, the witness who saw the covered shape in the truck, the backpack found along his route, the lack of any alternative explanation. They argued that Marcus had encountered Jessica either at the bus stop or shortly after, had placed her in his truck, had driven southeast while discarding the backpack, and had then disposed of her body in a location that remained unknown despite extensive searches. The defense argued that circumstantial evidence was not proof, that cell tower data was imprecise, that witness memory after 13 years was unreliable, that the prosecution could not even prove Jessica was deceased. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of any forensic link between Marcus and a crime. They argued that the community's desire for closure had turned suspicion into false certainty. Marcus Webb did not testify in his own defense. He sat at the defense table each day, wearing a suit that appeared too large for his diminished frame, his face betraying nothing. Observers later described him as eerily calm, almost absent, as though the trial were happening to someone else. Linda Caldwell testified for the prosecution, describing the evening of February 14th, the growing suspicion, the years of doubt and fear living with a man she believed had harmed her daughter. When asked if she thought Marcus was guilty, she looked directly at him for the first time in years and said, "I know he is." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On September 27, 2019, they returned a verdict, guilty on all charges. Marcus Webb showed no reaction. Linda Caldwell wept silently in the gallery, surrounded by family members who had traveled from Columbus for the verdict. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later. The judge, noting the severity of the crime and the lack of remorse or cooperation from the defendant, sentenced Marcus Webb to 25 years to life in prison. Before imposing sentence, the judge addressed Marcus directly, asking if he had anything to say, anything that might provide closure to Jessica's family. Marcus looked up for the first time, his eyes finding Linda in the courtroom. He spoke 3 words, "I am sorry." Whether he was apologizing for what he had done or simply for the pain he had caused remained ambiguous, another gap he declined to fill. He was led from the courtroom and transported to a state correctional facility, where he remains as of this writing. Jessica Caldwell's body has never been found. Investigators continue to follow occasional leads, and Marcus has been questioned multiple times about the location, but he maintains silence on the subject. Searches have covered hundreds of square miles without success. Linda Caldwell lives in Columbus now, having finally left Millbrook in 2020. She has started a foundation that supports families of missing children, channeling her grief into action. The yellow house on Sycamore Street stands empty, the paint now peeling in larger patches. The swing set collapsed in the overgrown backyard. The town of Millbrook returned to its quiet existence. though the name Jessica Caldwell is spoken less frequently now, less in terms of mystery and more in terms of memory.